Having suffered from depression since as far back as I can remember, it's an issue that I'm sensitive to when I read or watch television. Look, I'm guilty of being as big a jerk as anyone throughout my life, and I'm going to live with that guilt for the rest of my days, especially as I get older, develop more empathy, and grow. But I've learned to approach subjects that are delicate with more care than I used to. Depression, suicide, schizophrenia, none of these topics are fodder for humor for me. Ergo, it was with great trepidation when I learned that this novel involved a protagonist who suffered from various forms of mental illness. However, it was with great relief when I discovered that the copious amounts of humor that can be found here never cheapen the affliction nor flinches from its effects. Indeed, Silver Linings Playbook, written by Mathew threads a fine needle, and the reward is downright charming. Even Kenny G's moments are treated with a certain amount of care. In this review, I will only be covering the book, as I did not know that it was made into a movie until after I started reading it and a friend of mine told me about it. This was a book I chose completely at random, browsing the bestsellers list of an online ebook store, knowing nothing about it except that it sounded vaguely familiar. On the subject of mental illness, to say that this book deals with mental illness would, however, limit or miss the point completely. It's about closure and shedding our old skin. It's also about finding ourselves having to take diversions in life, but accepting those little forks in the road as okay. From the ashes of the flame rises a phoenix, and it's okay that this avian creature is just an odd little bird. So, I suppose this book is classified as a romantic comedy, but it's more than that. The previously mentioned themes don't allow the more lighthearted scenes and even the melodramatic ones to plunge this book into sugary schlock. Pretty Woman, this book ain't. Nothing against Pretty Woman, but this doesn't fall into that category exactly. Our main protagonist, Pat Peoples, returns home from an undisclosed time away and is trying to pick up the pieces of his life and reunite with his estranged wife. Ever the optimist, Pat sees the world in a glass-is-half-full kind of way. Every cloud, according to him, has a silver lining. This optimism, however, can also be seen as a form of delusion and one of his mental conditions. However, the medications he takes seems to address other aspects of mental illness, namely aggression and depression. So the reader is left to decide if Pat is just your consummate optimist or suffers from delusion. The notion is pivotal to the book's resolution, by the way. I tend to think that Pat is just a good guy. The first act starts with Pat returning home from what he calls the bad place, a neural institution of sorts. He is quickly reacquainted with his brothers and his best friend and meets new folks along the way. The most important of them in this story is a girl by the name of Tiffany, or a lady by the name of Tiffany. His best friend's wife's sister, if I can remember correctly. She is complicated. She is as pessimistic as Pat is a shining light. Where Pat's motivations in this book are clear from the go, making his actions either heartbreaking or admirable, Tiffany's motivations, and she has them, are murky and deliberately confounding. Even when her admitted motivations are revealed, they end up being sort of a red herring, and you get a huge cathartic swarm of explanations towards the end of the novel. But the big reveal is obvious to me if you pay attention to the clues sprinkled throughout the third act of the book. Pat's mother, Jeannie, is probably the most supportive character in this book, and her bond with her son is admirable. This causes tension between his father, who genuinely loves his family, but is resentful of Pat at times. His father is one of those quintessential old-school fathers, you know, the ones who don't really know how to talk to their sons. They express love through proxies. For example, American football here is used either as a way of connecting to his father or a way for his father to dole out any semblance of love towards his son. It is also indirectly a method used by his father to distance or punish his son and his wife. If he loses a football game, for example, then he just watches TV and he kind of blocks everything out. Football is used here to explain how Pat perceives the world and how he reacts to it. Although it's a ubiquitous part of the book, you don't really need to be a huge fan, and trust me, I'm not, of the sport to understand what it means to Pat and to enjoy the scenes that involve it. Likewise, jogging is used to somewhat the same degree to further illustrate Pat's friendship to Tiffany. Hilarious moments ensue when his mom and dad are having makeup sex after a particularly good Eagles game. Pat accidentally walks in on them in bed with their sheets pulled up to their necks, having just caught them in the act. Quickly, he gets dressed, goes down the street, and knocks on Tiffany's door. "My parents are having sex right now," Pat explains to Tiffany, to which she laughs and gets dressed to go jogging. It's a way for both of them to sort of escape the traumas of life. And I think all of us hearing our parents' bed squeaking upstairs while they achieve detente would be such a trauma. All right, so what I'm able to discern is this book is basically in 3 acts. The first act sets up the universe, the characters, and the overall dynamics between the main characters. The second act deepens the plot, fleshes out the relationships between the characters more deeply, and manages to do so without feeling like it's slowing down. Instead, the book never feels like it's slowing down. The third act starts off with a straight tonal shift, but not in a bad way. It returns to its whimsical, somewhat childlike charm by the end. By the middle of the third act, though, the book takes a slight tonal shift for a chapter or two. Instead of following Pat's story told from a first-person point of view, we get a dual narrative via letters. Breadcrumbs towards the story's resolutions are sprinkled throughout. The tone isn't bad, it just changes a bit. Pat's optimism starts to look like an Achilles heel here. According to my Nook e-reader, about 63% into the book, it takes a really strange turn via a letter that is presented to Pat from Tiffany. I had to reread the letter to make sure that I was getting it all correctly. I'm not saying it's strange in the sense that it's off-putting or doesn't fit the story. Rather, it puts real wind in the sails of the plot, but smacks you upside the head. It also serves as a major plot point to move the main character towards their resolutions. Throughout all 3 acts, but especially in the third act, you start to see what kind of person Pat is and just how perceptive he is. Though Pat suffers from delusions and has to take up to 8 pills a day, he is highly intelligent and highly perceptive, noticing things like the way his mother reacts to him when he asks if his brother has a girlfriend. He uses his spidey senses to determine that his mother's excuses for hiding his ex-wife's photos aren't telling the entire truth, something that he is able to confirm later in the story. Despite being keenly aware of his surroundings and possessing a high emotional IQ, he sometimes approaches the world much like a child. Repeating certain phrases like the mantra to control his anger, for example, he says, "It is better to be kind than to be right," and this is repeated several times throughout the book. Pat is also very sensitive about what others feel or think. Sometimes this causes him to overreact to conflicts he has with others, and he feels terrible when people in his inner circle aren't aware that their words hurt him. For example, when his friends trolled Dallas Cowboys player Terrell Owens for having attempted suicide by overdosing on pills, Pat internalizes this callous attitude by projecting this hatred on himself, wondering why others can't see that his need to take medications, some for depression, places him in the same category as Owens. Whatever Pat was like before he was sent away, the Pat Peoples that returns to normal life is empathetic and often overly analytical. His descriptions of moods is never nuanced, though, nor described in obscure or pedantic terms. For example, Pat says, and I quote, "I am so happy. I am impossibly happy," to describe the sweet moments that he has as an Eagles fan during a really successful game. With a therapist, 15 Indian men, and his own posse. You'll have to read the book to understand what I'm talking about here. The last 3 chapters of the book are a roller coaster ride, much of which I was able to guess would be the case. I think I predicted most of the major plot points or outcomes of the story, even why Kenny G was his nemesis, but it doesn't matter. This book is about the ride, not subverting expectations. Ultimately, the last few paragraphs of Silver Linings Playbook are so sugary sweet, so perfect, that you can forgive the author if it feels like he's deliberately tugging at your heartstrings. And even if it's not the ending the characters had originally hoped for, it's the ending we, the reader, secretly wanted from the book all along. Pat called his old life his old movie, and the life that he's building now his new movie. Well, Pat, I hope this new movie, i.e. the sequel, touches me as much as the original did. Great job. Okay, for the book rating, I looked at readability as pretty easy. It used plain language. It had to use plain language because it was doing it through the voice of Pat, so I gave it a full moon. Pacing, I gave it a full moon. This book did not slow down, not even in the middle of the book. In interest, I gave it an almost full moon. There was just a lot of football talk that just kind of I was like, okay, this is kind of overkill. It's just a personal preference. It doesn't mean that the book is a bad book or anything. And also, I'm not really into romantic comedies, so the fact that I really enjoyed this kind of, it says a lot. And overall, I gave it an almost full moon as well. This is a charming book. It's a great read. It's a fast read, and I really enjoyed it. All right, thank you very much, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. That would help me a lot. I am trying to get this channel started, and you would be helping me. Thank you.